Hi listeners, Joelle here offering an advanced apology for the sound in this episode. Unfortunately, we had an audio issue that left me sounding a bit like a robot. Fortunately, the problem is limited to this episode. Apologies again, and thanks for listening.
Hi, and welcome to the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. My name is Joelle Mitchell, and I'm one of the hosts of the show. The aim of the podcast is to rapidly increase the knowledge and application of psychological health and safety in workplaces worldwide. To help with this, we have regular guests from around the world who are leading the way in this important area. But before I introduce our guest and topic for the day, allow me to introduce my co-host, Alicia Pappas. How are you today, Alicia?
Hi, Joelle. I'm not too bad, thank you. How are you going there in Perth?
We've just had a Nando's for lunch, so we're feeling pretty pleased with ourselves. We ended up talking about evolution over the lunch table, which is pretty highbrow for us.
Nice one. What happened to Nacho Fridays?
Well, yeah, Zambo's is closed for renovations, so we had to come up with an alternative.
Nice one. Nando's it is.
Yeah. It was an acceptable alternative.
Nice one.
All right, and weekend coming up. Any big plans, Alicia?
Not really. It's nice weather in Melbourne this weekend, so I'm going to take my dog, who's very high energy and active, out and about. There's a festival called Kabloom in Melbourne, so it's like a flower exhibition out in the eastern suburb. So dog friendly. So I'm taking Max there.
Oh, that sounds nice. Dogs and flowers all in one place.
Yep, should be good.
Wonderful. All right, well, let's introduce our guest for today, shall we?
We shall, yes.
All right, so he holds a PhD in Organisational Psychology with research interests in the areas of work engagement and worker wellbeing. His research collaborations with industry partners have been published widely in peer-reviewed journals and edited books. He's also the author of the Handbook of Employee Engagement, Perspectives, Issues, Research and Practice. He is currently the Senior Lecturer and Coordinator of the Masters of Organisational Psychology program at Deakin University. Welcome to the podcast, Dr Simon Albrecht.
Very glad to be here. Thanks, Joelle, for inviting me. Thanks, Alicia, for having me on board.
It's lovely to have you here. We were just mentioning beforehand that you were a lecturer at the university I did my undergraduate at many years ago. So I do actually recall you from back in the day.
Well, it's been a long journey, so you're not alone. There are a number of people that I've had conversations with over the journey, and nice to keep in touch and nice to reconnect with many of those. So pleased to be here.
Well, it's great to have you on. I'll hand over to Alicia to kick us off.
Yes. So, Simon, we always start the podcast episodes with a generic question. So we ask all our guests what their favorite podcasts are or what they're kind of listening to at the moment.
Mostly music in my downtime. I'm not a massive podcasty. I don't listen to a lot of podcasts. My job kind of gets me reading lots of research papers and white papers and student assignments and stuff that comes through the feed. So I'm kind of more of an eyes guy than an ears guy, unfortunately. But I look forward to hearing podcasts, and I do, without sounding ingratiating, actually listen to some Flourish DX podcasts. I find them very interesting. Example, Tony Lamontagne's podcast I thought was really very interesting, a positive, pragmatic approach to how do you go about creating healthy workplaces for people. So Tony, always interesting and always very worthwhile listening to. I heard Kat Page talking about well-being in the workplace, and that was great. Kat's an awesome person. And her perspective, I think, on sometimes you have to be where the organization's at, find a starting point, was one that I took away from that particular podcast. Who else have I listened to? I've listened to colleague and friend Michael Leiter. Michael's always really engaging, really interesting. Burnout, an awesome research track record. So yeah, my ears are always well open when Michael's talking about burnout. Kirsten Way's been on, a whole bunch of really good people. So, despite not being a massive podcast listener, I've picked up on quite a few really interesting talks on your platform. So thanks for that.
Yeah, so you've been tuning into the Psych Health Safety podcast. That's the main thing.
It's the only one you need, really.
Yeah.
That's probably it, yeah.
We do have quite a few Deakin University alumni or current, researchers and academics. And like you said, Michael Leiter, he was a past Deakin University.
Still adjunct, actually. Michael's still.
He is. Even though he's back in Canada. Yeah. So we're glad to have you on as another Deakin researcher and academic in this space. So just tell us a bit about, because I know we know you're at Deakin now, and as Joelle mentioned, you've been at Curtin University in the past. Tell us about your professional career to date.
Well, yeah, so as Joelle said, Curtin, it seems like a pretty long time ago now, but yeah, what did I do? I did undergrad psychology, 4-year psychology at UWA. Got through that, finished that, did some research assisting at UWA for a few years, took a bit of a break, came back, did some research assisting at Murdoch University in Western Australia. From there, I think I enrolled in a Masters of Org Psych at Curtin University. Back in those days, Org Psych didn't quite have the profile that it's got these days, and it kind of took you a while to actually find out that such a thing existed and what it looked like and what you could do within that space. So I was really, really grateful that I found that space, and at Curtin did the Masters. Probably from there started working in the consulting space, or continuing to work in the consulting space. Worked with Ron Cassiope at an organization called Integra, and with a whole bunch of other people. Did some associate lecturing in OB at the Curtin Business School. So that was a useful academic training ground. I then moved into the School of Psychology at Curtin, where Joelle and I may have sat in the same room and maybe had a conversation or not. Spent there 10 years or so, working alongside people like Peter Savastos, who's an awesome human being and a great academic. Moved to Melbourne, 10 years at Monash, working in the Masters of Org Psych program at Monash. In their wisdom, they decided to close that program after about 10 years. So it was a brief stint to Brisbane, to Griffith University, spent a year there with good people up in Griffith, before coming back to Deakin. And I've been a Deakin for about 10 years, working in the Org Psych program at Deakin University. Good colleagues, good place, good students. So happy to be doing it. Sounds like a pretty long journey. I've been to a fair few Org Psych programs around the country, which is great because I guess it means I've connected with a whole bunch of bright, young, enthusiastic students that have been through those programs, that are now out being really successful, doing really good things in organizational context. So that's kind of the best part of the job, I think, is kind of keeping connected to the people that have been through the various programs and catching up with what they're doing and how they're doing it and how they're doing. So that's a really positive part of the program. And I suppose, another thing is the colleagues that you meet along the way in those various programs. I've met very smart people, very good people that are doing good things. I mentioned Peter Savastos, I mentioned Ron Cassiope from the early days in Perth, and I think they were kind of very influential in helping me figure out what is science, practice, organizational psychology, how do you go about doing it, what's helpful, what's not. So I'm grateful to those two in particular. And there are many others. Good part about the job is that you get to go to overseas conferences and meet some kind of heavyweight academics from different parts of the world, as well as heavyweight academics from Australia. So I've been very fortunate to be able to do that. So yeah, it's been a long journey, but it's been a really enjoyable journey, and the journey goes on.
Awesome. So Jabal,
Sorry, Alicia.
sorry, I was going to say you're next on the list. The next question.
Yes. Yeah. So Simon, can you tell us what you're currently researching?
In terms of current research, it's a bit like what I've been researching for a long period of time. But yeah, currently I've got in review a paper about organizational change engagement. So what is it? Why is it important? And importantly, what are the drivers of organizational change engagement? So the idea behind that thing is, well, we've got employee engagement, which we'll no doubt chat about today in some shape or form. So there can be parallel forms of engagement, and one of them might be something like change engagement, because as we know, change is kind of like a constant. People are experiencing so much change. We know that change impacts employee well-being. That can be in a positive way or it can be in a negative way. So the idea here is to try and figure out, well, what are the organizational resources, such as senior leader sponsorship of change, human resource capability to have processes and procedures and policies that support people through change, change vision, clarity of organizational goals. So they're kind of macro organizational kind of factors that might influence the extent to which people feel excited about change, motivated about change, up for the change that oftentimes just keeps coming down the pipe in organizational context these days. So beyond the organizational level resources, there are job resources, like at the more local level. Do I get information about how this change or these changes are affecting me and my job and my team? Am I getting a chance to be involved in processes around the changes that are going on in my local area? Is my supervisor supportive of change, and to what extent? Do I get learning and development opportunities as a consequence of this change process? So the research is around what are the organizational, job level resources that help people feel upbeat, motivated, positive about ongoing organizational change, because change is ongoing. But that's one piece of research that's underway. I recently did something about, again, in the engagement space, what are the job resources that impact upon people's experience of meaningfulness at work? So I think increasingly people are talking about purpose and meaning and how important that is in their experience of work. So let's go back to the basics and say, well, what are the kind of job resources that seem to be most conducive to meaningful work? And if we have meaningful work, does that help facilitate employee engagement in different organizational contexts? Turns out it does if you collect the data and you do the analyses and you write it all up. And it's things like learning and development opportunities. And it's things like enriched jobs. People have got variety in their jobs. And those two were probably the most important factors that drove people's perceptions of, is their work in a sense perceived to be meaningful? And the relationship with engagement kicked in as well. So that was kind of the story as it unfolded. Maybe one more current research thing. Recently published something on pro-environmental engagement, pro-environmental employee engagement. So kind of the premise for that one is probably, kind of imagine if every employee every day or every week did something that kind of helped environmental initiatives within organizations, then cumulatively, this might actually be a kind of a cool bottom-up approach to help address the top-down stuff that obviously needs to happen in terms of how do we make organizations more sustainable. So we know people close to the front line, to the shop floor, to the coalface, have got good ideas about how we can do things differently. So the idea, again, is tapping into what are the organizational pro-environmental resources, what are the pro-environmental job resources, that will help people feel kind of enthusiastic and engaged and upbeat and positive about pro-environmental initiatives in organizations. So a bit of a one-trick pony. There's kind of this engagement theme, obviously, and it's a bit about, well, the model seems to work for me and it helps people understand what's going on in their context. So I'm very happy to keep kind of progressing and pushing the horizons and the boundaries and the fences around that kind of way of thinking to see how it can help organizations get better at what they want to get better at.
Mhm.
Yeah, fantastic. And it's, I think that it is important to have people who do that really in-depth work and really focus in on the nuances of these types of contexts, but especially where it can then still come out and sort of give results that can be applied and to actually, create value, I guess, rather than just engaging in theoretical arguments, which those of us who are practitioners can maybe find a little bit pointless. But I always love to see really good quality applied research being done that I can, look at and say, okay, well, I can see how I can actually make use of this in my work. So it's fantastic that you're doing that.
Cool. Thanks for that.
Yeah. So Simon, what would you say are some of the core principles and values, and what's kind of underpinned your approach to your research to date?
Well, maybe it picks up on what Joel was just saying there. I think applied research is really important. Kurt Lewin said way back something like, no research without action, no action without research. So if you put it around the other way, no action without research, no research without action. I think that's a very kind of cool approach to help connect industry, consultancies, and academics. So I think one of the key things is, I've tortured students over the years with this models, theories, frameworks. Models, theories, frameworks. They're really kind of useful. I think they're great conversation starters. They help understand what's going on in an organizational context. They can help communicate what you think might be going on in an organizational context, mindful of the context. So you're not just chucking a model or a theory or a framework at something, but actually working with it to say, well, in the back of my head, I'm thinking whatever, let's say climate, organizational climate. If I'm having a conversation around climate with students or with a client, it's maybe the competing values framework is buzzing around in the back of my mind. Okay, so they're focused on this part of their business, but are they focused on that part of the business over there that might complement this particular part of the business? So we just have a bit of a conversation around that. So the model, the theory, the framework is kind of driving the understanding, driving the conversation, and maybe then driving some action to address opportunities within the organizational context. So that'll be one for sure. And being an org psych in that area, evidence-based practice is clearly something that we take quite seriously. And as I said, I've often got my head in a paper and trying to figure out what do all these fancy stats mean and how does it relate to anything that we can do in an organizational context. And I think it's important that the researchers are doing the research, but applied research. So we've got to kind of qualify the science part of this practice science sometimes. We can, I agree, Joel, it can get a bit boring and stodgy and dry, and how the hell can I use this in any practical kind of a way? So yeah, we've got to be pragmatic. And that means not necessarily, double-blind, controlled, experimental, whatever's interventions to see if this works as opposed to that works. It's working with people in a collaborative kind of a way to say, well, how can we make this better for you on the basis of what the best available evidence is kind of suggesting to us. So I think, there's a couple of things: the models, theories, frameworks, the evidence-based practice, the idea of the context. So you don't just throw those things at any individual context without having a deep conversation or conversations around what is that context and what does it mean for you? how can we operate within it successfully to make it better if you want to do that. So there's that. And I guess the final one I'd say is that I know on this podcast series, there's a lot of conversation often around stress and burnout and bullying and whatever. And I fully get that, and I fully understand the importance of all of that. But I guess my practice is a little bit more on the sunny side of the street. So I'm interested in engagement, I'm interested in community, I'm interested in commitment and those kinds of constructs. And maybe, just maybe, the theory is that if you take care of some of that stuff, then some of the other stuff gets automatically taken care of. So they're kind of principles, values, if you like, that have underpinned my thinking and teaching and practice around OD and org psych. Theories-wise, I think you've probably picked up on this. I'm kind of a JDR guy, a job demands resources person. Has anyone on the podcast series talk too much about the JDR and what that is?
I think it's probably just one of those common theories that, you know, underpins so much of what we talk about here. So I think people make reference to it. I don't think we've had anybody explicitly on sort of explaining it in any great detail.
Well, that ain't going to be me, but I find it useful. Again, you know, it's an applied theoretical lens. And if I focus on the positive side of the JDR, it's again about this idea of resources. So I'm not so much focused on job resources, even though they're really critically important. I kind of also am focused on organizational resources, as well as the job resources. And then in the JDR literature and thinking, there's this thing called personal resources, which is kind of like the psychology of how are people experiencing their work. So we've got organizational resources, job resources, personal resources, and all those system of resources work together to influence people's engagement, the extent to which their well-being is positive, enthusiastic and motivated at work. And I guess most of us and most employers would be wanting people who are motivated and happy and positive and energetic and up for it at work. And I think most employees would similarly say, well, look, if I could choose between a really drab and horribly boring, mundane job and something that gives me a bit of a buzz, I'm going to go with the thing that gives me a bit of a buzz. So this is a good applied kind of lens to help us understand how can we get to that space? What's going to help us get to that space? We'll never fully get there, and you don't want people that are, you know, crazy enthusiastic the whole time and crazy, you know, involved in everything and, you know, never going home because they love it so much. That's not what engagement is. It's more about, you know, a psychological state that helps people feel connected to their work, helps them be enthusiastic about their work, feel like they want to be involved in their work, they want to make a positive difference in their teams, in their role and in their organization. So that's kind of why I think that JDR and extensions of the JDR are really helpful for organizations to kind of get a handle on what do we need to do that's going to lever the health and the well-being of our people so that all of the good downstream outcomes like absenteeism, turnover, individual performance, extra role performance, profitability, all of that stuff, that there's some pretty good evidence saying that engagement is associated with that. So that's why I think the theory, if you like, is a pretty helpful kind of a theory. So it informs, as I mentioned in terms of the research we're doing, a lot of that research.
Mm-hmm. Great, that's a really comprehensive summary. So you talked a bit about well-being, but more of a focus on employee engagement, so not really focus on the well-being side per se. What's your understanding of, in terms of what the research says around employee engagement as it relates to employee well-being? Because a lot of people think of those two constructs quite separately. So especially in an organization, you know, employee well-being kind of sits in an HR type of a function or a role, well-being itself, or health, safety, well-being, and then you've got kind of employee engagement sitting somewhere else, maybe in another HR team, and the approaches or the measurement around both of those can be quite separate. But there's research on both of those constructs and a relationship between the two. So what's your understanding of that?
You've been in academia, you know all about this. There are a million different competing views on this, but yeah, I think they're certainly related constructs. Engagement is oftentimes conceived of as synonymous with well-being. Engagement is well-being. Other times, engagement seen as a dimension of well-being. So, for instance, your listeners might be familiar with Seligman's PERMA model. So, positive affect, engagement, positive relationships, meaningful work, accomplishment, achievement, PERMA, PERMA for those things. And so there's engagement sitting in someone's model of psychological well-being. I mentioned previously that I think engagement, well, it is a positive psychological state. So it's when you're feeling optimistic, it's when you're feeling motivated, it's when you're feeling enthusiastic. So they are certainly aspects of what a lot of people, and most people, I think quite rightly, understand well-being to encompass. So some of the negative stuff like anxiety and depression and stress, some people put that into the well-being bucket. So we've got the positive experience, the positive affect, we've got the negative experience, the negative affect, and both of those things are considered when considering employee well-being. You want the absence of the negative affect, and you want the presence of the positive affect. And some people would say you've got to measure both. And some people might say, well, look, if we just measure engagement, we're kind of taking care of the other side of the road, the dark side of the road, because we've just figured out how motivated, enthusiastic, involved, striving people are. And that's a good proxy for where we want to understand our well-being space to be focused. So yeah, it's a tricky one. I think it won't be resolved quickly, a universally agreed definition of what well-being is. But I think what we've got to do, and practitioners that are listening to your program hopefully are switched on to this, is that whatever you think it is, you've got to make sure that you measure it in a very congruent way that can be demonstrated to be valid. It's measuring what it says it's measuring. And it's reliable so that you can make some kind of real, meaningful assessment of, did our well-being go up or down or stay the same from time one to time two? So the measurement piece is really important. And the measurement's got to relate to the understanding of what well-being is, to the definition of what well-being is.
Yeah.
So that's the take on that one.
Yeah. I see them both as outcomes of other things. Sure, that I think they feed into each other. Obviously, if you've got employees that are engaged in their work, their well-being would likely be positive and they'll be having good well-being outcomes. But there's other drivers and factors that would feed into both of those. So that's where we talk a lot about, what are the work factors that contribute to both engagement and then therefore well-being. So they're both kind of engagement and well-being are more outcome indicators of other things going on in a workplace, whether there's hazards or, positive work factors happening that will then influence engagement and well-being as well.
Yeah, I fully agree with you. And that kind of sits with that resources kind of perspective. Yeah. So it's psychosocial factors, the enabling factors, autonomy, supervisor support, learning and development opportunities, job enrichment, all of those things are going to impact engagement and therefore they're going to impact well-being. So if you want to make the case that engagement leads to well-being, you've got to demonstrate that the measurement of those two constructs aren't the same thing. They're two different factors. So as I say, with that PERMA example, you've got Seligman saying it's an aspect of well-being. So you've got to measure it all. Some people might say you just have to measure positive affect and negative affect, maybe job satisfaction, and combine those things together to give you an index of well-being. So yeah, same page.
Yeah. And there's different ways to do it, obviously. Different ways to measure. Yeah.
Absolutely. A million different well-being models, a million different engagement models and measures. There's no universal, unfortunately, agreement as to how do we define and measure these things. But common characteristic, I think, is for engagement, that upbeatness, the enthusiasm, the motivation, the involvement. So irrespective of the definitions, that's usually an element, or if not the defining feature of how people understand engagement.
So in terms of your research that you've given us a good summary of, as it relates to change and engagement and resources, without you specifically focused on well-being, what would you say have been the most significant findings from your research that actually relate to employee well-being or employee mental health?
Yeah, hopefully I've given you a bit of a feel for that thinking, that causal kind of thinking, that organizational resources are important, job resources are important, that personal resources are important, that lead to, and if we say engagement is at least a part of well-being, they lead to well-being. So probably what I've done that I'm pleased about is that it helped with conceptualizing what are the levers that organizations in a practical sense can focus on to drive employee engagement. What can you do? Where can you focus your investment of energy and money and time in order to achieve these kind of positive outcomes? And I like the idea too that it's kind of a system of resources that you've got. You can't just focus on one thing, like we'll do self-efficacy training, or we'll do empowerment focused on giving people more control. These things will help. But if you haven't got the organizational resources as a set and job resources as a set, leading to personal resources and engagement kind of as a set, then you're probably going to make some progress, but you probably won't make the progress that an integrated, coherent, widely understood kind of appreciation or experience of those resources will bring to an organization's health well-being index. So that'd be probably it's rehashing a little bit about what I've overviewed, but I think, that's kind of what it is that if you want to get to those places, there are a lot of levers that are available to you, and the research will help you identify what they are, and the models and the theories and the frameworks will help you get a narrative, story that you can communicate within an organizational context to help people understand, okay, I get it. We've got some opportunities to do this here, or an opportunity to do something else over there. So, that would be the takeout, if you like, without going into the specifics of, well, you could do some intervention training around, let's say, personal resources. And you can. It turns out that we have got some decent interventions for org resources, for job resources, and personal resources. So personal resources where a lot of people tend to focus, that sort of individual, how do people kind of develop a resilience or coping strategy for what the organizational resources or the job resources might throw at them. But nevertheless, you can actually just focus on some of those things. And again, we go back to the theories, go back to the models, go back to the frameworks. You kind of pick up 10 or 12 key kind of psychological constructs that if people are feeling, we know this, there's a lot of literature and a lot of theory around this, if they're feeling like they've got control, if they're feeling that they're competent in their role, if they're feeling like they're connected with others in their organizational context, then it's more likely they will be motivated and have higher psychological well-being. Self-determination theory helps us understand that. Needs theory, sort of achievement theory. People need an opportunity to get things done, to achieve goals, to tick things off, to say, look, I did that. That's a cool thing. Related to that, they need an opportunity to learn and grow. Most people want that need satisfied, the need to, I'm learning something different here. I'm actually developing myself as a person, as a worker, an employee, through what I'm doing in my work. So again, that's good theory, good research to back up these psychological experiences. But even every intervention can kind of focus around, like, well, if we're going to do that, if we're going to make that change, what does that mean for how people feel about their job in terms of their control? What does it mean in terms of their connection with others? What does it mean in terms of their competence? Do we need to give more training and learning opportunities around that? So even though they're kind of abstract theories at one level, I'm trying to argue that I think they're kind of practical at another level. You can actually use these things that are well validated to drive change in organizations, to drive change for the better.
Yeah, and even as you talk about some of those, individual level, personal approaches, when you're talking about autonomy and achievement and accomplishment, it's not, from what I'm hearing, it's not just about, checking in with staff if that's happening. It's, are we as an organization actually fostering that? Are we providing opportunities for that? Which is, tying in that, rather than just leaving it up to the individual. Are we also providing, the work environment that allows staff to thrive in that way?
Absolutely. So that's organizational. Are the senior leaders kind of modeling that? Are the policies and practices in the HROD space supporting that and promoting that? At the job level, are people actually having jobs that are designed in a way to be able to exercise some autonomy? Are their supervisors equipped and resourced to be kind of supportive, to understand how to be supportive? So I was just down in Hobart, took a flight actually, first time in 2.5 years or something around. Society for Mental Health Research Conference in Hobart, which was good fun and nice to be out of Melbourne for a short period of time, to be somewhere different, and first time for Hobart, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. So that was kind of like a bit of a deeper dive around one of those job resources. So we know that job resources from the meta-analyses, that's a driver of employee engagement. So let's do supervisor support. But what aspects of supervisor support are the ones that might be most salient in terms of driving employee engagement or driving the extent to which people feel and experience that their work is meaningful? So there was a bit of a research project I did there that looked at, and did that with Andrew Marty from Sachs Consulting, and I think Natalie Ringenbergs as well. If we break down supervisor support into a couple of dimensions, is one of those dimensions or two of those dimensions, are they particularly salient in terms of people's experience of meaningful work or people's experience of engagement? And supervisors need to give feedback. They need to make sure that nobody's mucking up in the team and getting away with murder. They need to provide emotional support. They need to provide informational support. They need to provide some autonomy. So collecting data around those dimensions of supervisor support, guess what? Just like the grey literature says, autonomy is probably the big hitter. Don't go micromanaging your employees, because if you want them to be engaged, that ain't going to happen. So that's another way that you can use these models to practically identify strategies to help engagement in any particular context.
That's a very practical example.
Good.
Don't
I'm
micromanage.
wondering. Yeah, don't micromanage. Yeah.
Don't micromanage.
Simon, a little bit of a slightly off, well, not really off topic, but I guess I've seen some suggestions that too much engagement might lead to burnout. Have you looked into that sort of relationship at all?
No, myself, I haven't. I've dabbled in that literature a little bit. So Wilmar Shalfali and I think Michael Leiter have done some stuff in that space. They're related constructs, but they're different constructs. So they're not the opposite sides of the same coin. And as I said earlier, I think it would be a mistake for people to be 100% of the time absolutely energized, enthusiastic, and revved up and fully absorbed and involved in what they're doing at work. We need to have some space. We need to step out. We need to manage relationships and working relationships. So yeah, I think that's why engagement scores are kind of tricky. You know, everyone's trying to get the engagement scores higher, and I think that's probably a good thing as long as you measure it properly. But don't ever expect them to be 100% of the time, because that would probably be indicative of an organization that might be pushing a bit too hard. You got people that are kind of, you know, over enthusiastic, and you know, people like that, but sometimes they're not as helpful as the people that are enthusiastic but not over enthusiastic.
Yeah, so to the point where it's helpful rather than a hindrance, I guess.
Yeah,
I've seen, I think I was looking at an article today that was actually sort of commenting on that, you know, the majority of the workforce are coasting. So they're, you know, sort of 20% are engaged, 20% are disengaged, and then the rest are coasting. And this was sort of framed as a bad thing, that we needed to get more people into the engaged side of things. But yeah, I'm not sure. I think that, you know, you sort of, you go through your phases where you are very engaged in what you're doing, and then you do ease back a little bit, and you sort of, you know, you fluctuate between those two. And if you're spending all of your time being hyper engaged in your work, you don't have any capacity left for anything else other than work.
I think, yeah, that's a valid point, good point. And it kind of brings in, again, the narrative, the story. If you've got autonomy at work, you've probably got engagement, and that autonomy might play out in terms of, I need some time to step back. I need some time to, you know, do something different. I need some time to chill out, you know, whatever that autonomy enables you to do, like micro breaks at work, we know are really important for psychological health and performance at work. So yeah, if you've got to think again about the model, you know, if we've got this stuff in place, the organization is supportive of people's psychological health and physical health, and we've got jobs designed in such a way that you can actually do take care of yourself in a way that's important to you as an individual and your team, then you can be engaged, and you don't have to be engaged 100% of the time in the red. You don't have to be at max. You might hear in the background Formula One buzzing around here. Those guys are fully in the red. I'm in South Melbourne, which is not far from Albert Park, which is where the Formula One is. And from my balcony, it's very loud. I've tried to soundproof it a little bit here, but yeah, we've got that going on in the background if you hear it.
Well, yeah, they certainly want to be fully engaged while they're racing around at those speeds. But I imagine once they're out of the vehicle, their mental state changes a little bit.
Yeah. Well, there's, what is it? One of the definitions of engagement, it's vigor, dedication, absorption. I think the absorption thing, those people are going to be in the flow when they're traveling at those ridiculous speeds in very, very dangerous kind of environments. So yeah, I would say they're engaged when they're driving, and that's for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. It's I find Formula One such an interesting case study into so many aspects of sort of human performance in the workplace, and it's just such a unique environment when you're looking at performance.
Yeah, I love watching them in pit lane. So this orchestrated, beautiful, time to the second kind of operation that everybody's rehearsed a billion times, and it happens so wonderfully smoothly, that it's a great example of what can you do if you've got a very clearly defined task and skilled people that want to get it done. So there are lots of really good examples that we can take out of stuff like that.
Yeah, or even just the impact of a small change. Like my background is human factors, so I think last season they made a change to the machines that were using to tighten the wheel nuts or something, and somebody just completely they were on autopilot and the thing hadn't disconnected properly, and they thought that it had, and what looked like a minor change, from an engineering perspective, when it came to actual performance. It ended up giving them a delay of a few seconds of actually getting back out of the pit again. So interesting stuff, but a little bit of a divergence from what we were talking about. So do you have some practical tips for our listeners?
Practical tips. I'll sound a bit like a cracked record. Go to the models, the theories, the frameworks, because they're really, really useful. Make sure that you're using evidence as best you can, if it's relevant to your context, and check that out. Beware of the bright, the shiny, and the new. There's a lot of really good stuff that we know already, that if we can focus on that and work on that and invest in that, we're going to make some changes. So sometimes I think we get distracted by what's the latest thing and what are they doing down the road that's so cool, and if we're not doing that, we're not cool and we're not contemporary and whatever. Well, it doesn't matter how you call it or how you package it. I think oftentimes if you have that clear focus on what do we think is the best thing we can do to make a positive difference to the health and well-being of our people and the performance of this organization, that's the thing we're going to focus on. So that'd be a kind of a set of tips. I think just we've got a lot of good stuff there. Let's stick with it. Let's try it, and let's adapt it to our own particular context, and just get stuck in. And let's get it done, because it's doable. All of those things that we've talked about, those organizational resources, those job resources, those personal resources, that engagement, if we follow that model through, it's not rocket science. It's not that difficult. It's really just a commitment to getting the work done, to enabling the conditions that are going to set that up.
Yeah, and the context piece there, I think, is the piece that is often missing when in practice. And that, this is, what our competitor or our peer or whoever it is doing, and they've had great success with this program. So we'll poach the person who implemented their program, and we'll get them to do it exactly the same way here. Then everybody's shocked when it doesn't work.
Massive fail. And I think, as I said, I've been around for a while, and that OD orientation, that OD value set that we talked about earlier in this chat, of genuinely being curious about what's going on in an organization and having genuine, authentic conversations with people about how is it for people in this organization? How is it for you in this organization? What have you tried? What do you think's worked? Why has it worked? Why hasn't some other stuff worked? So there's a bit of work to get the platform right. And I agree, if you just pluck something off the shelf and insert it and turn the button on, it's probably not going to work. It'll be a failed investment.
Yeah.
So, look, Simon, this has been a really interesting chat, and I've really appreciated the opportunity to sort of delve into, the nuances of what being a scientist practitioner actually looks like in good practice. So that's been a really wonderful aspect of this chat for me. If you were to look to the future, what would you say are your hopes for the future of workplace mental health?
The future. I think we made massive progress, which is one thing to be acknowledged over the last decade. I remember when I started, it was really hard work to kind of amass some resources, whether they be people or information or programs or legislation or context, to help us understand these issues. And I think over the last, let's call it 10 years, there's been a massive increase in the capital around healthy workplaces, what's going to protect and promote health and well-being in organizational contexts. So I'm kind of optimistic. One of the things that I think might be a future trend, if you like, and I'm very happy to support this trend, is that maybe there's a bit of a connection between social justice and well-being. We've seen ESG kind of initiatives in lots of organizations, and I think that's the beginning of something that could be kind of important. So dealing with inequalities, dealing with climate, dealing with a whole bunch of different social kind of issues, because those things are going to play out in organizations in one shape or form. It's a bit about do we need to do anything to kind of heal what we do in this organization to make society a slightly better place? Are there opportunities for us as an organization to be doing things that are going to make the society that we operate in a slightly better place? And I think with that, there will be individual, team, and organizational improvements in well-being. So I think and hope that might be one thing that, as we look into the future, people like organizational psychologists, people like OD consultants, people like human resource practitioners, people like health and safety practitioners, etc., can contribute to that kind of a cause.
Yeah, and you talked about that earlier with your research at the moment, pro-environmental research and engagement in that space. And if you're working for an organization that is pro the environment and these societal factors, you're probably going to be more engaged, and your well-being is probably going to be more promoted.
Yeah, and I think really good research question, really good applied research question, and the evidence is starting to emerge to say that you're right on the money. That is in fact the case.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Awesome. So I know, organizational industrial psychology, it's quite broad. It covers a lot of different factors in a workplace. That's not just focused on, well-being. You work with and mentor students, given your role, at Deakin University. What would you, we have students listen to the podcast too. What would you say to any up and coming students or other professionals that want to kind of work more in the workplace mental health and well-being space? What are your words of advice for those people?
Do it, because it's important to do it, and do the best you possibly can. Be prepared that sometimes progress might not be as quick and as radical as you might hope when you're maybe sitting in a classroom at a university thinking, why isn't this happening like this? It's just a no-brainer. Sometimes there are a lot of political forces and other forces that are just preventing things happening positively and quickly. So there's a little bit of that. But no, it's a good fight. So you're in the right game. Go hard. Use your models, theories, frameworks. Listen to people within organizations. Collaborate genuinely with people in their context to try and understand where they're at and to understand where they want to be, and to help them design practical programs and processes that will help that journey from where we are to where we want to be take place. So that would be the advice I would give to current students and former students or prospective students, hopefully.
Very
Fantastic.
Good class there.
Well, Simon, that brings us to the end of our chat for today. So I'd like to thank you again so much for joining us today and really, giving us a bit more insight into employee engagement in particular, and sort of all of the nuances, and reminding us that certainly in psychology and probably more broadly in social science, there's never any real consensus on anything.
There's some consensus, but not final consensus, probably.
No.
Yeah.
Groups of consensus.
Well, again, thanks for inviting me. It's been delightful having a chat, and hopefully it's been of some interest to the people that listen to the podcast.
Oh, I'm sure it will be. So if our listeners would like to reach out or get in touch with you, Simon, what's the best way for them to do that?
Through my email, probably, which is simon.albrecht@deakin.edu.au. And Albrecht, for those people who might have difficulty spelling that, is ALBRECHT.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. So that's it for today, listeners. Don't forget that you can watch the recording of this on our YouTube channel if you are so inclined. Otherwise, check out our Flourish DX LinkedIn page for the short clips that we publish. You can also connect with Alicia and I directly over LinkedIn and have a chat. Drop into our DMs or comment on the clips. We're always interested in hearing opinions, or if you want to come on the podcast and have your say about something, we're always interested to hear from potential guests as well. So that's it for today, and we will catch you next time.